Let's return now to our big debate about the relationship between enclosure and the agricultural revolution. What we want to know is, was there a causal relationship between these two events? Was enclosure necessary for the agricultural revolution? The old wisdom, which you already may be familiar with, says yes, of course. The open fields fought innovation, and you may be able to relate to this. If you've ever had to participate in any kind of body where unanimity was required for any change, what you know is that change never happens. The open fields required unanimity for any kind of major change, like new technologies, or to enclose, or to use any kind of new techniques that were hallmarks of the agricultural revolution. And furthermore, enclosures would have ended common use, particularly over pastures. And in a common pasture where the entire village is just setting their animals out to eat, no individual villager is going to care about how much grass their animals are eating and whether they're eating too much grass, how much are they leaving for the other villages. We think perhaps that this kind of common use was less efficient than private use over pastures. So there's many reasons to think that indeed enclosure was necessary for big agricultural change. But there's another more nuanced argument that is becoming more of the accepted wisdom now, which is that actually, maybe not. Because as it turns out, there was a lot of innovation happening in the open fields. Now look, I can understand how this feels maybe a little bit obscure. Again, we're talking about one weird little place. But actually, the stakes of this debate are high. This is one of the greatest debates in all of social science. I am not exaggerating. This case has been used to justify a lot of policy choices and decisions over economic systems over a lot of human history. This is truly one of the great debates. Where you come down on this issue influences how you feel, well, very narrowly about how agriculture should be conducted, but more broadly, basically about how you feel about individual versus communal decision making. And also about the efficiency and wisdom of the old ways of doing things, about traditional societies. Many people, I think, are given to broadly romantic notions of the old way and a trust in the way people did things in the past, while other people have just an unnatural contempt for the way that the past was working. Like, of course the new way is better. Furthermore, if we really allow ourselves to get a little bit loose with the details, this is kind of a debate about the efficacy of private property as a basis of economic growth. Right, again, individual versus communal decision making. We're going to circle back to a lot of these notions when we talk about the causes of the Industrial Revolution and whether those causes were maybe because of rules or just prices. We'll come back to that. If you take a look at Allen's introduction to the enclosure and the human, which I've posted, it sets up actually a really beautiful explanation of these debates. Bob Allen has devoted quite a lot of his long and illustrious career to debating this relationship. It's really one of his main passions. And over time, he's been developing this argument more and more. And the version that he presents in his book, The British Industrial Revolution, which part of which is assigned to you, I think has a really interesting development of this idea. And so I've put a quote here where he summarizes his argument as this. Most of the causation, he says, runs from expanding world trade to the growth of urban manufacturing to rising agricultural productivity and finally to large farms and enclosures. The city drove the countryside and not the reverse. Let me kind of break down what he's trying to say here. He argues that what's driving both enclosure and the agricultural revolution is a third factor, which is that English farm labor is expensive. So, English farmers improved methods and enclosed because they were willing to do anything to employ less labor, and both of these would have allowed them to employ fewer people. So that's a really different notion of causation than a simple line from enclosure to the agricultural revolution. We're going to talk quite a bit about expensive English labor next week, so stay tuned for more details on that notion. Allen, in a lot of his work, has introduced a further idea here, which is the idea that there were actually two agricultural revolutions, and that when you know about the timing of the changes in agricultural productivity, the importance of enclosure looks really overstated. So he thinks there was a first agricultural revolution that happened really, really early, actually before enclosure. And in this first agricultural revolution, there were lots of changes in technology and organization, and those were made in the open fields. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the fundamental rules of historical causation, right? That if these changes happened before enclosure, enclosure could not have caused them. That's the idea. He says furthermore that there was a second agricultural revolution that happened again later in the first half of the 19th century. The period of parliamentary enclosure, when most of the enclosure is happening, is in the middle, and that's a period of stagnation. You can see this in several graphs and other representations. First, here's a graph of a 5-year moving average, so basically a smooth average of farm output from early years, from about 1550 to say 1750. And what we see here is a huge growth in farm output over this period. When we move further in time, from 1750 to all the way to 1850, we see a period of relative stagnation when all that parliamentary enclosure is supposed to be happening, and maybe even a little bit later. And then finally, there's more of a takeoff way after. These kinds of numbers are supported if you take a look at net exports and imports of wheat from England. Actually, after enclosure happens, England starts to become an importer of wheat rather than an exporter. So it's not producing all that much relative to its population. All of this makes one think that maybe Allen has a point about the relationship between enclosure and the agricultural revolution. I'm going to make a final point here. It's natural to be wondering, well, what the heck is going on outside of England? And what I'll say is that not a lot, okay? And here's what's going on. So there was kind of an enclosure movement outside of England, and it's happening around the same time, but it's going much more slowly on the continent. Let's start by examining the case of France, which is actually most similar. So one common theme we'll come back to over and over again is that France is just doing overall a lot worse than England throughout this period. To start, French farmers were just much, much smaller on average. So what this means is that when enclosure started to happen, there were a lot more people who were going to be hurt by the loss of the commons, so there was a lot more resistance to enclosure. Furthermore, the French landlords, right, the folks who really would have benefited from enclosure, they already have so many privileges relative to English landlords that there was just no incentive, no fire in their bellies to demand enclosure. So all this together meant that enclosure in France proceeded much more slowly. What about a few other European cases? Well, Prussia in this period is very, very poor, and their agrarian reforms and some enclosure will not happen until towards the middle of the 19th century. We'll talk about that later. And the Russian Empire, meanwhile, they have a very, very low-level and complicated system of agricultural organization. They have serfdom until the 1860s, and then they don't get enclosure until kind of 1906. But problems of scale in agriculture continue to dog the Russian Empire and Russia, the Soviet Union, into the 1930s. We'll discuss some more of this in terms of what is going on the continent in just a few weeks.